Thank you so much for your interest in our presentation, in which we focus on gender-just language pedagogies in translator and interpreter education. The three of us, Ems Asinowski, Leo Schmidt, and myself, Eva Seidl, are excited to present a topic that is meaningful to us.
This is how we have structured our thoughts and ideas. We will first tell you about our background, then we will talk about language in translator and interpreter education. After that, we wish to focus on gender justice, and finally, we will discuss challenges for interpreters.
This is where we are located, at the Department of Translation Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. Above, you can see the university's main building, and below, the building which houses the Department of Translation Studies. The picture on the lower right illustrates a snippet of my colleague Ems and my professional future as conference interpreters working from an interpreting booth.
As for our background, or put differently, our academic friendship, it has blossomed over the last years. I have known Ems since they took several German language classes with me within the BA program Transcultural Communication. And I met Leo when he attended a language teacher education program which focused on adult language learners. Together with Ems, we presented and published our ideas on intersectionality in translator and interpreter education. And the three of us together are currently working on a paper on sustainable assessment.
In other words, Eva is a German language teacher, and Ems and I study conference interpreting as a master's degree, but with different working languages, meaning the languages we study and plan to work with. Mine are German, English, and Spanish, and Ems studies German, English, Russian, and Hungarian.
Working together on this presentation and on previous joint research projects, we have actually experienced what Johnson and Reifenberg express in their recent book on the entanglements of undergraduate research, belonging, and vocation. Quote, faculty mentors and co-researchers form the community in which undergraduate researchers learn more fully what makes them curious and what issues matter to them, who they are and with whom they identify, who they want to be, and where they are going.
Our talk is very much informed by John Gray, who, in a paper on transgender inclusion in language teaching and teacher education, bluntly states that we are living in anti-intellectual times. Despite that situation, or perhaps because of it, there have been more and more calls to action when it comes to socially just pedagogies, focusing on diversity, equity, and privilege awareness in language learning and teaching. The titles of these books truly speak for themselves. Activism in Language Teaching and Language Teacher Education. Redoing Linguistic Worlds, Unmaking Gender Binaries, Remaking Gender Pluralities. And Social Justice in Language Education, Taking Action.
This brings us to our second item on the list, language in translator and interpreter education. Eva, whenever you talk about language learning and teaching within our field, translation studies, you use the acronym TILT. Can you explain what that stands for?
With great pleasure. TILT means translation and interpreting oriented language learning and teaching. This emerging subfield in translation studies is still in its infancy and focuses on how to best learn and teach languages, any language, for students' future professional purposes as experts in the language service industry. In fact, as Cerezo Herrero and Schmidhofer argue, TILT should have a place at conferences about translation studies and foreign language teaching, where researchers have the chance to meet other colleagues and future collaborative action can be discussed and undertaken.
At conferences like this one, we can help raise awareness of the characteristics of TILT. In the TILT classroom, students as future language service providers should develop a service-oriented mindset. They study languages in order to help others communicate, which is why they need to reach and maintain high proficiency levels in all of the working languages throughout their careers as translators or interpreters.
Let's focus on gender justice now. Gender just pedagogies have, so far, mainly been discussed in the context of language teacher education and critical language pedagogy. However, with this slide, we would like to draw your attention to the growing research in translation studies on topics such as gender-fair human or machine translation, or gender-fair post-editing beyond the binary. Findings show that automated translation tools systematically misgender or erase non-binary identities by interpreting, as just one example, singular they as plural. For the particular setting of the TILT classroom, however, queer and gender non-conforming pedagogies have not yet been explicitly theorized.
Now, when I wish to create gender-just teaching and learning materials in translator and interpreter education, I can highly relate to what Selburn writes. I am a insert sexuality, insert race, ethnicity identity, insert gender materials writer. I want to be inclusive in my materials, but I'm scared to make a mistake and I don't know if I can represent insert marginalized group people well. How do I make sure I do a good job of including a diverse set of narratives in an authentic and appropriate way? I don't want to do something offensive or use offensive language by accident.
In the gender-just teaching and learning context, it is important to remember that there's no such thing as a blanket statement solution, as what is right for person A may be completely wrong for person B, and a solution that is desired by one person may be offensive to another. It is not possible to speak for an entire heterogeneous group. There may be different opinions within the group and a lack of consensus. For that reason, it's very important to see the person first, rather than the disability, sexual orientation, religion, etc. In other words, it is important not to reduce anyone to their differences and not to see anyone as a minority group representative. Dealing with these topics can be challenging because it requires you to admit that you lack knowledge in a specific area. The best way to counteract that is by staying open to learning new things and asking questions. Ideally in one-on-one conversations or in smaller groups, so that no outing of anyone is forced. And in such cases, it is also important how you phrase your questions. So rather saying, "How would you like to be addressed?" or "What pronouns do you use?" rather than, "Well, what's your real name?"
Finally, we would like to conclude with challenges for interpreters. Research on debiasing machine translation and post-editing shows that translators bear responsibility for respectful representations of marginalized groups. But how do we handle this responsibly?
Now I would like to present some challenges specific for interpreters and translators. One of the things we have to consider is that interpreters and translators need to have a vast amount of cultural, linguistic, and political knowledge. Because imagine yourself trying to convey content in one language to another. You need to not only be aware of the different words, but also how they are used. For example, what is the correct usage in the specific languages? In France, for example, l'Académie Française, and in Spain, la Real Academia Española, say what is correct French and what is correct Spanish. That also means saying what is the correct way to refer to different kinds of people, what pronouns to use. When you want to say and address a group of people in France or in Spain, for example, you'd use the masculine form, just the masculine form. That's the correct way of speaking, according to these institutions. And we as interpreters and translators need to be aware of these standards, because it has to do with our code of ethics, our professionality. We want to speak correctly, write correctly, translate and interpret correctly. So we would need to adhere to these standards, but at the same time, they might clash with our own set of morality. So what do we do then? Do we try to have a correct language use as dictated by the different institutions? Or do we try to express ourselves in our own way, in a way that's more gender just, maybe? At the same time, we need to consider that we are fulfilling a job and we want to keep fulfilling the job. So if an employer already has set standards or norms on which font to use, maybe just using a male font to address different kinds of people, then we would also need to follow these standards and norms. Otherwise, we will hardly get another job at that employer. We as interpreters and translators are in a unique position because we are the voice of another person. We might be the ones who are speaking, but not with our own words. We need to try to convey the content and intention of the original speaker, which also means maybe not conveying things that we ourselves would say or think that way. So we are in a unique position where we need to align our professional standards with our own set of morality. Sensitivity surrounding identity is another point that should be discussed, because in high tense situations, we need to be also partially the ones who create a nice atmosphere for everyone so communication can work. We are communication facilitators after all and language mediators. So, for example, if somebody is applying for asylum, we should try to create a safer space for them, because oftentimes they might come from a country in which they were not able to express themselves freely. Maybe that was a reason why they decided to come to our countries. If they have a gender identity or sexuality that's different from the norm, they might find it hard to express themselves. We as interpreters and translators need to be aware of this and try to find a strategy in which all people can feel represented and respected. We also need to be aware of the different ideals and priorities translators and interpreters have. Because when translating, you're trying to have as close of a translation, meaning the same text in a different language, as possible. You try to get all the intricacies, all the stylistic choices, all the content, all the details in there, and you have the time to look up whatever you need. That's the big difference between translating and interpreting. You being able to research during your work in progress and correct yourselves. Because in interpreting, we don't aim to have the perfect version. We just want to have as good of a version as possible. We want to get the content across. So, while interpreting, clarity and content is what's most important, more important than the style, which is also something we need to consider when we are interpreting, because a way of addressing people that's more gender inclusive might take a longer time to say, and especially when we are interpreting in a booth, we might not have we might not have the time to say all of that. So what do we do? These are some of various challenges that we as interpreters and translators face when we try to be gender inclusive.
Here you can see our references and email addresses. We thank you once again for your interest in our talk.